So what I'm going to talk about today is some of the preliminary qualitative results from my doctoral dissertation work. So I'm interested in problem-based learning in online discussions, obviously because we've got a lot of online stuff going on here. And we're going to be looking, there we go, at a bit of an overview. I've got quantitative results, but I'm not going to be sharing those this morning. So first off, we're going to talk about what the project is and the two programs that are involved in this, the BSc ES and the EM program and what that is. I'll talk a little bit about what problem-based learning is for those who may be less familiar with it, an introduction to the community model and why I've chosen that as the way to have a look at the research questions I'm interested in. I will introduce one of the major research questions that goes with my dissertation. There's actually a subset of them. Talk a little bit about some of the qualitative results, present some of the conclusions that I think are kind of relevant to us as we go forward using problem-based learning in an online environment. And then there should be lots of room for questions at the end. So the two programs that are involved are the Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science program and the Bachelor of Science in Environmental Management program. The BSc ES program is a blended program. It takes place primarily in a face-to-face format, although we do use online discussions for some groups, so we have a blended element to it. The BSc in Environmental Management program, or the EM program, is primarily a distance delivery with on-campus residencies, structured very similar to most of the graduate programs here. Now, although the programs are very, very similar, and they carry a lot of content involved in common. What you will find is that the emphasis between the two programs is actually quite a bit different in terms of what the experience is. The ES program is what we would call our group of aspiring professionals. Most of these are younger learners. Average age for the cohort is about 26. For the most part, they are coming straight out of their two-year diploma programs at our feeder institutions, and they're really looking to come into the environmental field for the first time. Most of them have, while they may have been out working, they probably don't have environmental work experience at this point, and so they're really looking for the experiences that are going to teach them about teamwork and how to work together in a multidisciplinary team. And one of their big major capstone pieces is a 9-month team-based consulting project. So this is their big piece to take out when they go and look for work to say, hey, you know what, I know how to run a big project. Our EM program are people that are already working. These folks usually went out and got their diploma and then they went to work for a consulting company or a local government or an NGO or something like that. So they're bringing work experience to the table, and they're now at the point in their career where they're hitting the ceiling. The do not pass until you have degree ceiling, and so they're interested in coming back to complete their degree. So these folks are involved in 3 residencies separated by distance learning segments. Again, looks very similar to most of our master's programs here, and in a very similar age group, sort of that 32 to 35 age group. So these folks in general, they know about working in teams. They don't have that big consulting project, but they do have more courses in management kinds of skills, so tools for business decision making, those kinds of emphasis to kind of wrap their experience around. All right, so that's our two groups. Now, the thing to kind of keep in mind when we're looking at the research that I'm going to show you is the point of the research is not to compare blended and distance and say one is better than the other, because that's really not the point. What I'm more interested in is how the people that are enrolled in those programs are choosing to approach an online problem-based learning scenario. So it's not a this is better than that kind of discussion, okay? So problem-based learning is a team-based activity. It basically centers your learning around authentic, ill-structured problems. So problems where you might not have all the information to start with, and you need to figure out not only what the information gaps are, but how you're going to go about filling them. And it really is all about application of their learning to the real world. So this fits really well with the Aurora Roads model, where we want our programs to be applied and to be real world, authentic learning experiences that are gonna give our students the tools that they need to actually go out into the world and really work with things. In the case of the problems that we're gonna be talking about today, the problem evolves over time and initially comes equipped with some incomplete information, much like what happens in real life. All right, as far as problem-based learning in the RRU learning model, the work that I'm talking about and the course that it sits in was actually around and designed well before the RRU learning model was out there and articulated. But it takes advantage of a lot of those same things that we think are important in that learning model. So we think team stuff is important. We think authentic problems is important. So it's all about that kind of an experience. Now, when I initially started designing this for the ecotoxicology course, I was interested in it not as something that had a name at the time. I wanted an authentic problem because I'd had a little bit of experience using discussion groups, and I thought, hey, you know, it would be really neat to do something a little more involved. And so I sat down with the group, the CTET type group, and we sort of said, okay, well, what can we do? And there was some interest in the community of inquiry model at that point, and lots of interest in Bloom's taxonomy, and lots of emphasis on the instructional skills workshop. And all of these kind of gave us a whole bunch of ideas around active learning strategies. And so I thought, okay, this is sounding pretty good. Now, when I went back to start looking at this for my dissertation work and get into the literature review, at that point I think, ooh, this is a good fit. Guess what? It involves real world problems, and I'm really excited about this. And this is like, okay, this is great. And then there's more literature that says, oh, this is all about thinking like an expert, and this is all really good. And it's hypothesis driven. This is good. Students have to think about an idea, and then they test it, and I'm all excited about this because and then I think, boy, that was pretty good. I designed something that fits in this box really well. And then I looked at it and thought, man, were you ever lucky? Because this fit together with the learning model really quite nicely when all is said and done. The other thing that works really well in this context is the fact that problem-based learning is all about students learning to use the methods and the vocabulary for the discipline they're training for. So particularly in a multidisciplinary environment like environmental science, where what they really need to be able to do is look at the big picture and think, I need that concept from chemistry, and I need this concept from hydrology, and I need this one from biology, and these are all gonna come together to tell me something. It really helps them to start to think about those things in the way that experts in the field do. The hypothesis-driven piece becomes a really important thing because as an expert in your field, one of the things that makes you an expert in your field is you've got this big knowledge array. You've got all this vocabulary and all these facts that you know because you are an expert in ecology or chemistry or whatever. And so when you see a new problem in that discipline, you can look at it and go, oh, okay, that looks like the pattern from this particular example that I know about already. Can I apply those concepts? Students really can't do that because they don't have that big knowledge base to look at and go, oh, I recognize the pattern. And so what you get students trying to do instead is trying to memorize a whole bunch of disconnected facts in an effort to build up this knowledge base, but because the facts aren't connected very well and they didn't really understand the underlying concepts, they're kind of okay for an information dump, but they're not so hot at actually trying to make things connected. So because of that, problem-based learning works quite well because it helps them to identify what those gaps are and helps them to fill them instead of expecting them to be able to just recognize the pattern. All right, so why am I interested in using this in the ecotoxicology course? This is a course that pulls on lots and lots of threads. It's one of the capstone pieces for both programs because it sits at a point in the program where they should be able to pull on all kinds of science and social science stuff and look at big picture issues. So PBL helps them to foster the ability to integrate information from lots of different disciplines. So again, great fit for this. Your design of your problems can be used to scaffold learners that aren't quite there yet. So in the problems that I've designed for this course, we're not throwing them into the deep end of the pool and saying design a remediation strategy, because they wouldn't know how to do that, right? So what the problems that I've set up do is provide them a little bit of guidance. So, this is who you are in the context of this report. You need to Make sure that you know, for instance, have a list of all the plants and animals, have a list of the industries, have a list of the pollutants. So it provides them initially some scaffolding and some direction. But as we move through the problems, the scaffolding drops off. So by the time we get to the end of the course, the problem is, do the risk assessment. Give me a remediation strategy for all these contaminants. And they should be at a point now where they can go, okay, you know, what's the approach that I need? What kinds of things do I need to know in order to be able to put something out? This encourages deep approaches to learning. It's not enough to memorize it and try and dump it, because you'll never survive it in problem-based learning. You won't be able to produce a product at the end. And the other thing that I liked about it in the context that I've put it in is it's a writing assignment because it's an online piece regardless of whether the rest of the course is face-to-face or a distance module. And so it gives you that think time. You've got that processing time. You have to get it down on paper in bits and bytes or however you want to put it, but you have to get it up on the discussion group in a way that's going to make sense to other people. So you have to have digested the information sufficiently that we can put it out there and talk about it. And so that means that students have to think about what the information is, what does it mean, and how does it apply to the problem. All right, so what does the problem-based learning in the ecotoxicology course look like? When I first started doing this, like I said, I was really interested in, can I find a case study that I can work with? And I went and I looked at all kinds of case studies. And I thought, okay, maybe I can find one about a particular community and we can adapt it. And then I realized fairly quickly that most of the case studies I was looking at would illustrate one or two of the major concepts that I wanted for the course, but there wasn't really anything that kind of unfolded the way that the entire course would. And so I ended up actually designing a 4-part problem, which is our fictional town of Nobletown. And according to my students, if they ever come across a town called Nobletown, they're going to run very quickly the other direction because it is an ecological disaster waiting to happen. So it is a fictional community. They are given fictional industries that are located in our fictional community. And there are plants and animals that they need to figure out what they are. And what it basically is designed to unfold over the 4 parts. And it will take them through the steps that would be required for a risk assessment. And they're not in a place at the beginning of the course where you could say, you know, run a risk assessment on this. How much risk is there to the plants and animals from the industries that are present? By the end of the course, they're in a good spot for that, but they need all the information that they've collected all the way along. And I've scaffolded it quite heavily at the front end so that they have some steps and some support, and the scaffolding drops off as we move into the later stages. As I've mentioned, it's an asynchronous online activity regardless of the delivery of the entire rest of the course. The asynchronicity allows the teams that I make for my distance class to be established regardless of time zones. So I can have people in Eastern Canada on teams with people in Calgary or BC, and it doesn't matter. Everybody just gets up and does it when they want to. The other nice thing about an asynchronous delivery is it lets you go back and revisit ideas. So if we're having a conversation in person, right, if you don't stick your hand up and get your 2 bits worth in fast enough, the conversation moves on and you might never get to put your point in, particularly if you're somebody that needs to sit back and think a little. With an asynchronous online discussion like this, if you think of a great point 4 hours later, you can go back and put your point in and everybody can still see it and it's still part of that conversation. So it becomes a really useful learning tool and allows people to go back and revisit what they're doing. In the course, the participation in the online discussion is graded both as a participation for making online contributions, as well as the team is required to produce a report at the end of each of the 4 cases. So everybody has to take a turn to moderate and help put that report together. Everybody's responsible for what's in it. And if you don't post anything in the online discussion group to contribute to it, you don't get any of the points for the team portion. So it's a push to make them participate. Most of them probably would anyway, but it gives me a lever for those that are not really going to participate unless they're forced to. I use the same problem with both groups, and it's worth about 30% of the course grade. So in effect, this exercise takes the place of a midterm exam. And it allows me to see lots of the same kinds of things. How are you progressing? Are you keeping up with the reading? Do you understand the major concepts? All right, so I had some initial impressions because I've been running this in both programs since 2004. So there's a ton of archival data that's sitting on our servers. And I have a very nice research agreement that is in place between the research office and myself and the ethics people so that everybody knows what hat I'm wearing when. But initially my impression was the EM group was posting more messages, they looked like they were talking more, and the ES group was using it primarily as an information dump and a collection site for information. And I thought, okay, that's fine, they're using it in different ways, not a problem. What was sort of interesting when I decided I was gonna look at this as part of my dissertation work was, why is that happening? And what we're gonna talk about today is a little bit of why that's probably happening and what impact that has on the way that they organize themselves when they do online work. So, research question driving this piece is, do students from distance and blended courses take different approaches to asynchronous PBL? And if they do, does that change over time? So, that seemed like a good question. So now you need something to start looking at that in the context of. And there is a ton of different ways that you can do content analysis on online discussions. I've chosen the community of inquiry because it aligns pretty well with our learning and teaching model. It basically says your educational experience is really dependent on there being social presence and cognitive presence and teaching presence that are all gonna combine to give you this, hopefully, rich educational experience. And there's some parts of this we have control over, right? Teaching presence is all about how you set it up and whether or not you respond to your students in a timely fashion and all of these good things. Social presence is all about, can we develop a learning community? And I mean, we know from the way we do things around here, just putting people in a team does not make them a team, right? Just because you're in a group doesn't mean you get along, doesn't mean you interact. But we hope that our use of the cohort model here really helps form those social interactions so that people will engage when they're online. The piece that I was interested in for my dissertation research was this cognitive presence piece. And how do we look at that in an online discussion and see what's going on and what people are doing? So the cognitive presence piece of this model, as it was developed by Garrison's group, really says that there should be kind of 4 pieces going on here. You should be able to see evidence of triggering things happening, so people identifying a problem, some sort of sense of puzzlement about it. Okay, can we take this approach? That sort of question. Exploration is really all about information exchange, exploring the ideas. So if we're dealing with team stuff, this is the brainstorming piece. Hey, I found this great reference. Hey, did you know that the CME guideline for this is whatever, right? Those kinds of things. Sometimes they come with citations attached, sometimes they don't. Integration is more around constructing ideas and combining and connecting them so that we're really thinking about how things fit together. And the resolution is all about constructing and testing solutions and applying new ideas and coming up with a final report that really captures everything, all of those kinds of pieces. Now, when you apply this to just a regular discussion group, so if we have a discussion group, for instance, on, I don't know, why cats are cool. Okay, that's our discussion group. We're gonna talk about why cats are cool. We'll probably see all of those things. Okay, you'll see maybe evidence of, somebody will start off with, well, why do you think cats are cool, right? So we get a trigger. And then there'll be a whole bunch of just throwing ideas out there. And unless, as the instructor, we kind of push a little, you're probably gonna get stalled out at that brainstorming exploration stage where you're just kind of chucking ideas out, but you haven't really got them connected very well together, and you can't really make a whole lot of coherence to your argument about why cats are cool. Integration, we might see the odd post that connects them unless we've done something as an instructor to push that. And we probably won't see any resolution steps. Now, with problem-based learning, we're really all about getting to these last two stages, because these last two stages are really where lots of the higher order thinking is coming in. Okay? And even with exploration, if I'm adding citations to what I'm doing, or at least one citation to what I'm doing, I probably paraphrased it and I've picked out the important bits. So that's still some higher order thinking. So, you know, at that point, it's fitting pretty well. We're getting people to move along. So I was pretty excited about this because this matches up pretty well to what you would consider the stages for problem-based learning to be. We get everybody together, we have a talk about what we're gonna do, we brainstorm a whole bunch of ideas, hopefully we start hooking things together and we get to a resolution point. So, again, we get to a choice point, because if you're gonna do an analysis for online discussion groups, you have to decide what the unit of analysis is gonna be. And there's all kinds of arguments about what the best thing is to do. There are people that go out and say, okay, the sentence will be my unit of analysis. And if you start trying to do that in an online environment, you very quickly realize the sentence is a pain in the butt, because the sentence is not always very easily recognized in this particular environment. Think about how you write emails, right? Sentence fragment, ... Another sentence fragment that's maybe got another idea, right? Just recognizing what a sentence might be is more than a little challenging. Plus, you're dealing with students that are putting out probably a lot of sentences. So if you're gonna have 800 or 900 pages of transcript, trying to separate it by sentences is kind of a nightmare. So I went kind of to the other end of the route, and it's supported by quite a bit of the literature in this area, particularly by Garrison's group, that I decided I was going to use the message as the unit of analysis, because there's usually one big idea in there. And it also helps because sometimes the student's message is a map. There is no definition that I know of that a map becomes a sentence. So it really that decision helped deal with these things that weren't necessarily great fitting in the box, right? Because it didn't look like a paragraph, it didn't look like a sentence. That also had the kind of fallout effect of making the 900 pages of transcript a whole lot more of a manageable size that I was actually gonna be able to do something with. So I selected 4 cohorts that I could match, that I knew used the same problems, and I hadn't done a whole bunch of changes to the course so that we could match them up fairly effectively. So 4 cohorts of on-campus students, so 144 students, and 4 cohorts of distance students for about 108. Because all of my students are spread to the 4 winds, this part, under my research agreement, came under a very nice exemption from the Tri-Council, which basically says, I have no hope of tracking all these people down. There's really, as long as I'm looking at big picture stuff and I'm not taking quotes out of those things, then I'm okay to use that in sort of an aggregate format, because that automatically anonymizes it. So all the discussion forums got corded against our 4 categories: triggering, explore, integrate, and resolution. And I was really excited about this because I thought, yes, everything should fit in there. And then I ran into a problem. And the problem was there was a whole bunch of stuff sitting in other. And other is awful if you were trying to put things in categories. And so I had to look at all the stuff that was falling in other. And I realized fairly quickly that a lot of the stuff that was falling in other was organizational stuff they were doing. So this would be a student saying, hey, here's a sign-up list for the topics that we need to make sure that we research. It's not really a trigger, it's not an explore, it's definitely not an integrate or resolve, but it's pretty darn important in terms of how this team is gonna work together, right? Lots of other teams would take the hard scaffolds that I'd provided and use those as headings in their discussion group. There'd be no other text with it, you just have this heading. Again, it's pretty important for how we're gonna work together, but it doesn't really fit in any of the other categories. So having realized that I needed something other than other, I added an organization and moderator category that really helped capture a lot of these ideas that were pieces that we need for how we're going to work together, but they're not really fitting very well into the other categories. The other piece that I realized was a bit of a problem was the definition for the resolution category. And the problem with that one was the literature source says testing solutions. And I thought about this for a while, and then I realized that if we're working together and I post a draft of our final report for everybody to comment on, that is me testing a solution. I'm putting my draft out there for everybody to comment on and test. And whether you test it by fixing all my grammatical errors or by pointing out that I didn't have my facts right or whatever, we're still testing this together. And so this was an addition that I made to the resolution category. So now I've tweaked everything. I'm pretty happy with it. Unfortunately, I'd wiped out the first version of what I was doing in NVivo and had to start again. So now a little while later, we actually get everything in NVivo and can start coding stuff. Now, one of the first things that I actually did was ask the question, do my EM students or my ES students do significantly better? And although I'm not going to show you this, I did demonstrate a couple of things that you need to be aware of. Yes, my EM students do indeed produce significantly more messages on their discussion groups. Yes, my EM students do produce significantly longer threads than as compared to their ES counterparts. And no, they do not do significantly differently on their final exam. So everybody's getting to the same place, we're just getting there a little bit differently, which is all kind of good. So first thing that has to happen is a group has to get organized. And well, you're probably sitting there thinking, yes, but that's really self-evident. Yes, it is self-evident, but it's really nice when your model works out and shows you that it's self-evident and it's still actually happening. So this is an excerpt of some threads that were produced by one of my EM groups. And you'll notice all the yellow, and all the yellow posts are all those organization and moderator threads that I added that category for, that I said we're all about kind of getting organized and figuring out how we're going to work together. So both ES and EM teams do start with an organizational step where we get together and we figure out what our approach is, how we're going to do it, who's going to do what, all of those kinds of things we would expect them to do. With the EM group, because they can't meet face-to-face, that stuff ends up being really explicit, and you wind up with a whole string of yellow threads that start off the beginning of each one of these PBL groups for the EM group, just like you would expect. Now, the ES groups, you would probably think, okay, you haven't got any evidence that they get organized. That's not exactly true. There are very often single posts at the beginning of an ES group that say things like, don't forget we have a meeting at Wednesday at lunchtime. So they are getting together. And when I did some interviews with the most recent cohorts, yeah, we confirmed that they are meeting face-to-face and getting together and doing those initial steps that we're seeing so much more explicitly from the EM group. So regardless of whether we have them online or face-to-face, everybody is meeting to get organized. So that's kind of nice. We hope that they're doing that as instructors. So it's sort of nice that that's actually happening. One of the next things that I thought was actually really interesting is there is a distinct difference that is not necessarily driven by which group you're in, whether you're an ES learner or a distance learner. And that's the selection of whether your group is going to have organic thread organization or if you're going to use advanced organizers. Now, organic means that everybody's just going to start a thread whenever they think they need one. We don't necessarily hook them on to anybody else's ideas, and just because there's two of us that are working together on something, I probably am just going to start my own thread and throw my idea up there, and everything winds up as a primary thread within the discussion group. And so it ends up looking like this, right? So everything is indented only if it's a sub-thread, right, a reply to that thread. So if we look at the one that's on the left-hand side, which is the organic one, you can see everybody started a new thread every time they wanted one. You see that about half the time with the on-campus group and about 30% of the time with the off-campus group. Advanced organizers means that there is usually somebody in the group that has set up a bunch of organizational threads, most often by stealing the hard scaffolds from the problem and using them to organize the ideas. And they're really easy to recognize because you've got that yellow, that moderator, and then you've got the blue and the green and the other colors following underneath those. The other way that they're really easy to recognize is because if you look at the date and timestamps, you will have them all posted by one person, usually within about 4 minutes, depending on how many they had to post. So in the example that I've got on the other side here, Patrick was the moderator, and Patrick has posted 1, 2, 3, 4 yellow messages in the space of 2 minutes. And all he's done is grab the hard scaffolds and gone boop, 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 question 1, 2, 3, 4. We have to make sure we address these ideas. And then everybody replies to those threads. And if you're the moderator, at least if I'm the moderator, that's really great because I can go and grab those ideas for that particular section of the paper from under that thread. Again, the ES group does that about half the time. The EM group, the distance group, does that probably about 65% of the time. What's interesting about that is the choice looks like, from interviews, is a whole lot less driven by whether you're in the ES program or the EM program, and a whole lot more driven by who the dominant personality in your team is. So, whoever moderates the first time and organizes things, if they are somebody that says, it has to be done this way, and they set it up that way, and the team decides that they like it, they'll probably hang on to it. There are a few examples of groups that start out with the organic and then decide this is really not working for us. And so by case study 3 and case study 4, we've gone to advanced organizers. And there's a couple of teams that started out with advanced organizers all the way along, and then suddenly we're doing the organic thing for part 4. I would suspect that the reason that we had the switch has to do with who the dominant personality in the group is and whether or not everybody else was going to kind of fall into line with it. So a lot more about how the group is working together and a lot less about which program that they're involved in. Other behaviors that you'll see. This is not necessarily unique to either ES or EM. This is building on your own ideas. So this is really using the discussion forum as a notepad when you're doing research or writing. And again, it tends to be fairly easy to recognize because you'll get a whole list of explore posts, and then you'll get an integrate post. So in this example, Cynthia was doing some stuff on the coastal rainforest, and she's got a whole bunch of posts where, there's a blurb about bears, and then there's a blurb about fish, and, all of this kind of stuff. And then the last post is an integration post where she brings all of those pieces of information together, and it comes equipped with proper citations, and you can see the ideas being integrated. Some students will do this just because they need a place to kind of take notes as they're going, and it doesn't seem to bother anybody else in the group if they do that. Other students are doing it as a way to make sure that if I mandate there has to be at least 3 posts in a week, this is a way to do that. So you get some students that are using that as a push for this kind of a behavior. So it's not that there isn't critical thinking or higher order thinking involved in those explore posts, because ideally they're paraphrased, right? And hopefully they come equipped with a citation for where they came from, but you don't get that same kind of effect. And you need to, as an instructor, if you're looking at that whole works and you're trying to assess that, you really want to look and see, did they actually paraphrase, or is this a cut and paste flat out quote from that source and they've just gone, bonk, and they're hoping somebody else is going to paraphrase it. That's a different level of what's going on than if they're actually doing that on their own. Okay, document assembly is another sort of interesting piece of this because sometimes it's visible and sometimes it's not. So if we are looking at assembling this document from this discussion group, there's a few different approaches that they can take. Either somebody assembles the whole works probably within a couple days of the deadline, Or you set up a template and everybody fills in the template as we go. And then hopefully you're just doing the tweak and combine everything at the end. Or you just kind of actually have a rolling assembly as you go. And I've seen groups do this where very early on what you'll have appear is, here's the outline of our report. And what the moderator will do is grab the posts as they go and put them under the correct headings in the report. And this assembly rolls as we go through the whole project. So you'll see this appearance from the moderator 4, 5, 6, 7 times, depending on how long your discussion group lasts, moving through the whole course. Okay, so if they are assembling sections as they go, I have only ever seen that happen if they've used advanced organizers. Sort of makes sense that that might be the way it's going, because it's really hard to have rolling assembly if everybody's just starting a thread whenever they feel like it. Groups that use a template and everybody adds and combines it as they go tends to result in a lot more integration posts than you would expect. Again, because there's a lot more coherence of the ideas coming together faster in the group than if the document gets assembled at the very end. Okay, so how can we recognize when some of these things are going on? You can get a clue from just doing the coding, which is actually kind of useful. So this is the use of templates and rolling assembly. Notice the stuff in yellow. This is that moderator organizer group. So this was a bunch of threads that started off at the beginning. Here's a template that I think we should use for this table. And then everybody starts adding to it. So all the posts that are in green are all, I added something to the template and I added my ideas and I tweaked it. And so everybody's integrating ideas as we're moving down. Now, as the instructor, you still have to go through and read all of those, but you can see the idea integration happening as we move down that long stack of green. And so, again, you get way more integration than you would probably expect if they were assembling at the very end, and there tends to be a lot more commentary and a lot more pushing, not in a bad way, but just, are you sure that's right? Right? I think this might be a better idea. This might be more relevant. And so you get a lot more push and pull on what the facts are when they're using that kind of rolling assembly. Google Docs is interesting. It has a weird impact on some of these groups. Google Docs is a great tool, and interestingly, it changes the dynamic a bit. If they are doing most of their idea exchange on the Google Doc, and you still have a requirement that they have to post on the discussion forum, even though they're not using that for assembling their ideas, what you'll get is a lot of signpost posts. So lots of moderator groups, lots of moderator posts, but they're really more like, I posted the contaminant list to Google Docs. I posted this piece of information to the Google Doc. I did this to the Google Doc. So you'll get entire threads that are made up of nothing but these organizational and moderator threads, interspersed by a few explore posts by, I couldn't be bothered to go to the Google Doc and I'm just throwing it up here now, right? So you get a lot of that kind of piece in here. So if this is happening as the instructor, you almost have to ask for the link to the Google Doc so that you can see who's doing what, if the point is to assess the higher level thinking that's going on. Now, in my experience, most of the groups have been pretty happy to let me have access to that so that I can see who's doing what. Actually, I don't think I've ever had it be refused. But if you explain to them that I need to be able to see what you're thinking about, and I need to be able to give you a push in the right direction if you're going off on a weird tangent, it can be a really useful piece. So that's probably the easiest way to recognize it. And you'll quite often get posts that say flat out, here's the link to the Google Doc, right? Or I set up the Google Doc, and so you know that that's what they're actually doing. So as you might expect, many fewer posts with critical thinking indicators because you don't get integration and resolution things happening on the website when they go all gung-ho on Google Docs. Other things that you will see, lots of undocumented resolution. Somebody will ask a question on the website and nobody will answer it. Now, that doesn't mean it didn't get answered, because sometimes you can see, do you think we ought to put this in a table, and then you get the final report in, and this, whatever it was, is in a table. So obviously, that got resolved offline, but it doesn't show up in the actual discussion forum. So you need to be aware that there could be a lot of resolution that's happening and you're just not seeing it because they're doing things offline. Other things that kind of fit into this category, information that doesn't look like it was ever addressed on the discussion forum, but shows up in the final product, right? Again, somebody working hard in the background, but just not in a way that you can see it and evaluate it. And the other thing that can happen is you get documents that are handed in, and obviously they came together and they were assembled and they were edited, but it didn't happen on the site. Okay, so again, that kind of undocumented resolution steps that are happening that you might not be able to see otherwise. Document assembly location does vary, and it does depend on whether you're dealing with a face-to-face or a distance group. For the face-to-face group, the ES group, only about 18% of them did document assembly on the discussion forum. Not a huge surprise because they can sit down and do that in person. And according to the interviews I've got, that's often the way that it's done, right? We get the whole group around a table and we put the document together and we all sit around and edit it together. For the EM group, about 92% of it is assembled right on the site, usually in a way that you can see, which is kind of nice. Of the remaining 4 out of 5 that didn't fall into that category had notations on the forum that directly said, check Google Doc for the latest version, right? And it's obvious that the assembly and the editing was happening in that offline kind of platform. Other behavior that you can see that's actually kind of useful for tracking who's doing what. Documents, if they're assembled online in the forum for an online course, you can sometimes see them using strategies like signing out the document. So in this example here, that first post that's in yellow, Shannon put up a post and said, hey, draft coming soon. And everybody kind of went, okay, we know that this is coming. The post that's in orange is Shannon's complete draft of the report. And then what you see is spacing. There's a yellow, and then there's either an orange or a green. A yellow, and then an orange, yellow, and then a green. The yellow is always somebody saying, I'm signing out the document, I'll have it back in half an hour or 40 minutes or an hour or whatever. And then you get another post that has their edits or their changes to the document. So depending on how extensive the changes are, either that's an integration step or it's a resolution step if it's a major change. The other thing that can be interesting about this kind of a setup is if you look across all 4 case studies, you will sometimes see that it's the same people in the same order that do these sign-outs. Now, sometimes that's because they've set up an editing circle and they've said, you're gonna do it, and then you're gonna do it, and you're gonna do it, and so on. Sometimes it's more a case of whoever's free is gonna do it, but you'll always get the same very last person. And sometimes you get that same very last person signing it out because they're really good at editing, and sometimes that's the person in the group that just can't let go of it until they had the last touch on the ball. And again, which one of those comes into play depends on the dynamics in your team. It can be either one of those situations. The other advantage to this sign-out list kind of situation is you always know that you're working on the most recent version. And when you don't use this system and you're editing on the forum, what you'll sometimes get is I pulled it down and then somebody else pulled it down. We were both editing at the same time. They got put up and then somebody tried to grab the next one and goes, about 3 posts later, hey, none of my edits made it into the document because somebody was working on not the most recent version. So that can be alleviated by this kind of an arrangement. As I said, editing circles are pretty common. You see it a lot with the ES classes, but it's most often an in-person kind of thing. And as I've shown you already, they don't usually assemble their documents on the forum. There's really no need to, and interviews do confirm that that's usually an in-person, we're all gonna sit together and work on this together at the same time kind of situation. Again, the order in which this happens, same with the online guys. might be, here's the sequence of people that are gonna touch this, might be, this is who's available, and that last person might be, I'm either the best editor on this group or I can't bear to let it go until I've had the last touch. Okay, so what have I learned from the qualitative pieces of this? Actually quite a bit. I've noticed that the requirement to produce a final report acts as a real push towards getting integration and resolution moves in a way that you really don't see if there's not that requirement to produce something. The numbers that I'm getting, while I haven't done a great comparison with the literature yet, are pushing far more to the integration and resolution stages than you would expect for a normal discussion group. And the groups are a lot less likely to get stuck at that brainstorming exploration phase because they have to move on if they're gonna write the report. Resolution, the final report is occurring even though you might not be able to see it. Obviously it is because it got handed in and everybody got a grade for it, so that's all good. The choice of how a discussion forum is organized can be driven either by who's moderating or who the powerful personalities in the group are. And I've also seen examples where somebody has gone through and put up the advanced organizers. They're not actually the moderator for that case study, but they're the one that wants to get this going right now, right now, right now, and everybody else just kind of goes along with it. So you do get that, that kind of stuff happening as well. Use of a required number of posts per case may stimulate forum activity. It may also result in forum as a note-keeping device, which is not necessarily bad because everybody can see the sources and the buildup of ideas. But it's just something to be aware of. And the choice of how the report is assembled can influence the number of posts that show higher order thinking, whether you're doing Google Docs or assembling on the site or using rolling assembly or however you're gonna do it, it's gonna change the relative ratios of how some of those posts come about.